Good morning, fourth grade, and welcome back to our last week of Holes Read Aloud. In today's chapter, we're still kind of looking towards Big Thumb, and we're going to learn a little bit more about Zero and his backstory today. So let's hop right into that. Chapter 42. Zero became strong enough to help dig the hole. When he was finished, it was over 6 feet deep. He filled the bottom with rocks to help separate the dirt from the water. He was still the best hole digger around. "That's the last hole I will ever dig," he declared, throwing down the shovel. Stanley smiled. He wished it were true, but he knew they had no choice but to eventually return to Camp Green Lake. They couldn't live on onions forever. They'd been completely around Big Thumb. It was like a giant sundial. They followed the shade. They were able to see out in all directions. There was no place to go. The big mountain was surrounded by desert. Zero stared at Big Thumb. "It must have a hole in it," he said, "filled with water." "You think?" "Where else could all the water be coming from?" Zero asked. "Water doesn't run uphill." Stanley bit into an onion. It didn't burn his eyes or nose, and in fact, he no longer noticed a particularly strong taste. He remembered when he had first carried Zero up the hill and how the air had smelled bitter. It was the smell of thousands of onions growing and rotting and sprouting. Now he didn't smell a thing. "How many onions do you think we've eaten?" he asked. Zero shrugged. "I don't even know how long we've been here." "I'd say about a week," said Stanley. "We probably eat about 20 onions a day, so that's 280 onions," said Zero. Stanley smiled. "I bet we really stink." 2 nights later, Stanley lay awake, staring at the star-filled sky. He was too happy to fall asleep. He knew he had no reason to be happy. He had heard or read somewhere that right before a person freezes to death, he suddenly feels nice and warm. He wondered if perhaps he was experiencing something like that. It occurred to him that he couldn't remember the last time he felt happiness. It wasn't just being sent to Camp Green Lake that made his life miserable. Before that, he'd be unhappy at school, where he had no friends and bullies like Derek Doon to pick on him. No one liked him, and the truth was, he didn't especially like himself. He liked himself now. He wondered if he was delirious. He looked over at Zero sleeping near him. Zero's face was lit in the starlight, and there was a flower petal in front of his nose that moved back and forth as he breathed. It reminded Stanley of something out of a cartoon. Zero breathed in, and the petal was drawn up, almost touching his nose. Zero breathed out, and the petal moved towards his chin. Stanley considered placing it back in front of Zero's nose, but it wouldn't be the same. It seemed like Zero had lived at Camp Green Lake forever, but as Stanley thought about it now, he realized that Zero must have gotten there no more than a month or two before him. Zero was actually arrested a day later, but Stanley's trial kept getting delayed because of baseball. He remembered that Zero had said a few days before, if Zero had just kept those shoes, then neither of them would have been there. As Stanley stared at the glittering night sky, he thought there was no place he'd rather be. He was glad Zero put the shoes on the parked car. He was glad they fell from the overpass and hit him on the head. When the shoes first fell from the sky, he remembered thinking destiny had struck him. Now, he thought so again. It was more than a coincidence. It had to be destiny. Maybe they wouldn't have to return to Camp Green Lake, he thought. Maybe they could make it past the camp, then follow the dirt road back to civilization. They could fill the sack with onions and the 3 jars with water. And he had his canteen as well. They could refill their jars and canteen at the camp. Maybe sneak into the kitchens and get some food. He doubted any counselors were still on guard. Everyone had to think they were dead. Buzzard food. It would mean living the rest of his life as a fugitive. The police would always be after him. At least he could call his parents and tell them he was still alive. But he couldn't go visit them in case the police were watching the apartment. Although, if everyone thought he was dead, they wouldn't bother to watch the apartment. He would have to somehow get a new identity. Now I'm really thinking crazy, he thought. He wondered if a crazy person wonders if he's crazy. But even as though he thought this, an even crazier idea popped into his head. He knew it was too crazy to even consider. Still, if he was going to be a fugitive for the rest of his life, it would help to have some money. Perhaps a treasure chest full of money. "You're crazy," he told himself. Besides, just because he found a lipstick container with KB on it, that didn't mean there was treasure buried there. It was crazy. It was all part of his crazy feeling of happiness. Or maybe it was destiny. He reached over and shook Zero's arm. "Hey, Zero," he whispered. "Huh?" Zero muttered. "Zero, wake up!" "What?" Zero said, raising his head. "What is it?" "You want to dig one more hole?" Stanley asked him. "We weren't always homeless," Zero said. "I remember a yellow room. How old were you when you—" Stanley started to ask, but he couldn't find the right words. "Moved out?" I don't know. I must have been real little because I don't remember too much. I don't remember moving out. I remember standing in the crib with my mother singing to me. She held my wrist and made my hands clap together. She used to sing that song to me, that one song you sang. It was different though. Zero spoke slowly, as if searching his brain for memories and clues. Then later I knew we lived on the street. But I don't know why we left the house. I'm pretty sure it was a house, not an apartment. I know my room was yellow. It was late afternoon. They were resting the shadow of the thumb. They had spent the morning picking onions and putting them in the sack. It didn't take long, but long enough that they had to wait another day before heading down the... Sorry guys, technical difficulty. We'll start again. It didn't take long, but long enough so they had to wait another day before heading down the mountain. They wanted to leave at the first hint of daylight, so they'd have plenty of time to make it to Camp Green Lake before dark. Stanley wanted to be sure he could find the right hole. Then he would hide by it until everyone went to sleep. They would dig for as long as it seemed safe and not a second longer. And then, treasure or no treasure, they'd head up the dirt road. If it was absolutely safe, they'd try to steal some food and water from the camp kitchen. I'm good at sneaking in and out of places, Zero said. Remember, Stanley warned, the door to the rec room squeaks. Now he lay on his back, trying to save enough strength for the long days ahead. He wondered what happened to Zero's parents, but he didn't ask. Zero didn't like answering questions. It was better to just let him talk when he felt like it. Stanley thought about his own parents. In her last letter, his mom was worried that they might be evicted from their apartment because of his smell of burning sneakers. They could easily become homeless as well. Again, he wondered if they'd been told that he ran away from camp. Were they told that he was dead? An image appeared to his head of his parents hugging each other and crying. He tried not to think about it. Instead, he tried to recapture the feelings he had the night before. The inexplicable feeling of happiness, the sense of destiny. But those feelings didn't return. He just felt scared. The next morning, they headed down the mountain. They dunked their caps in the water hole before putting them on their heads. Zero held the shovel and Stanley carried the sack, which was crammed with onions and 3 jars of water. And 3 jars of water. They left the pieces of the broken jar in the mountain. This is where I found the shovel, Stanley said, pointing at a patch of weeds. Zero turned and looked up toward the top of the mountains. That's a long way. You were light, Stanley said. You'd already thrown up everything that was inside your stomach. He shifted the sack from one shoulder to the other. It was heavy. He stepped on a loose rock, slipped, then fell hard. The next thing he knew, he was sliding down the steep side of the mountain. He dropped the sack. The onions spilled around him. He slid into a patch of weeds and grabbed into a thorny vine. The vine ripped out from under the earth, but slowed him enough so he was able to stop himself. Are you all right? Zero asked from above. Stanley groaned as he pulled a thorn out of the palm of his hand. Yeah, he said. He was all right. He was more worried about the jars of water. Zero climbed down after him, retrieving the sack along the way. Stanley pulled some thorns out of his pant legs. The jars hadn't broken. The onions had protected them, like styrofoam packing material. Glad you didn't do that when you were carrying me, Zero said. They'd lost about 1/3 of the onions, but recovered many of them as they continued down the mountain. When they reached the bottom, the sun was rising just above the lake. They walked directly towards it. Soon they stood on the edge of the cliff, looking down at the dry lake bed. Stanley wasn't sure, but he thought he could see the remains of Mary Lou off in the distance. You thirsty? Stanley said. No, said Zero. How about you? No, Stanley lied, but he didn't want to be the first one to take a drink. Although they didn't mention it, it had become kind of a challenge between him and Zero. They climbed down into their frying pan. It was easy to spot from where they'd climb up. They eased themselves down from one ledge to another and let themselves slide in other places, especially being especially careful with the sack. Stanley could no longer see the Mary Lou, but headed in what he thought was the right direction. As the sun rose, so did the familiar haze of heat and dirt. You thirsty? Zero asked. No, said Stanley. Because you have 3 full jars of water, said Zero. I thought maybe it was getting too heavy for you. If you drink some, it'll lighten your load. I'm not thirsty, said Stanley. But if you want to drink, I'll give you some. I'm not thirsty, said Zero. I was just worried about you. Stanley smiled. I'm a camel, he said. They walked for what seemed like a very long time and still never came across Mary Lou. Stanley was sure they were heading the right direction. He remembered that when they left the boat, they were headed towards the setting sun. Now they were heading toward the rising sun. He knew the sun didn't rise and set exactly in the east and west, more southeast and southwest, but he wasn't sure how that made a difference. His throat felt as if it was coated with sandpaper. You sure you're not thirsty? He asked. Not me, said Zero. His voice was dry and raspy. When they finally did take a drink, they agreed to do it at the same time. Zero, who was now carrying the sack, set it down and took out 2 jars, giving one to Stanley. They decided to save the canteen for last, since it couldn't accidentally break. You know I'm not thirsty, Stanley said as he unscrewed the lid. I'm just drinking so you will. I'm just drinking so you will, said Zero. They clinked the jars together and, with watching each other, poured the water into their stubborn mouths. Zero was the first to spot the Mary Lou, maybe a quarter mile away and just a little off to the right. They headed for it. It wasn't even noon yet when they reached the boat. They sat against the shady side and rested. I don't know what happened to my mother, Zero said. She left and never came back. Stanley peeled an onion. She couldn't always take me with her, Zero said. Sometimes she had to do things by herself. She told me that I had to wait in a certain place for her. When I was real little, I had to wait in small areas, like on a porch step or a driveway. Now, don't leave until I get here back. Don't leave here until I get back, she'd say. I never liked it when she left. I had a stuffed animal, a little giraffe, and I'd hug it while she was gone. Stanley guessed that Jaffe was the name of Zero's giraffe. And then one day she didn't come back, Zero said. His voice sounded suddenly hollow. I waited for her at Laney Park. Laney Park, said Stanley. I've been there. You know the playscape, asked Zero. Yeah, I've played on it. I waited there for more than a month, said Zero. You know that tunnel that you crawled through between the slide and the swinging bridge? That's where I slept. They ate 4 onions apiece and drank about half a jar of water. Stanley stood up and looked around. Everything looked the same in all directions. When I left camp, I was heading straight towards Big Thumb, he said. I saw a boat off to the right, so that means we have to turn to a little bit to the left. Zero was lost in thought. What? Okay. They headed out. It was Stanley's turn to carry the sack. Some kids had a birthday party, Zero said. I guess it was about 2 weeks after my mother left. The kids looked the same age as me. One girl said hi to me. I knew I didn't belong at the party, even though it wasn't their playscape. There was this one mother who kept staring at me like I was some sort of monster. Then later a boy asked me if I wanted a piece of cake. But then that same mother told me, go away, and she told all the kids to stay away from me. So I never got that piece of cake. I ran away so fast I forgot Jaffe. Did you ever find him? For a moment, Zero didn't answer. Then he said, he wasn't real. Stanley thought again about his parents, how awful it would be for them to never know if he was dead or alive. He realized that's how Zero must have felt, not knowing what happened to his own mother. He wondered why Zero had never mentioned his father. Hold on, Zero said. We're going the wrong way. No, this is right, said Stanley. You were heading toward Big Thumb when you saw the boat off to your right. That means we should have turned right when we left the boat. You sure? Stanley drew a diagram in the dirt. Stanley still wasn't sure. This is the diagram that Zero drew for them. We need to go this way, Zero said, first drawing a line on the map, then heading that way himself. Stanley followed. It didn't feel right to him, but Zero seemed sure. Sometime in the middle of the afternoon, a cloud drifted across the sky and blocked out the sun. It was welcome relief. Once again, Stanley felt that destiny was on his side. Listen, Zero whispered. Stanley didn't hear anything. They continued walking very quietly, and Stanley began to make faint sounds of Camp Green Lake. They were still too far to see the camp, but they could hear a blend of indistinct voices. As they got closer, he occasionally could hear Mr. Sir's distinctive bark. They walked slowly and quietly, aware that sounds travel in both directions. They approached a cluster of holes. Let's wait here until they go in, said Zero. Stanley nodded. He checked to make sure there was nothing living in it, then climbed down into a hole. Zero climbed into the one next to him. Despite having gone the wrong way for a while, it hadn't taken them nearly as long as Stanley expected. Now they just had to wait. The sun cut through the cloud, and Stanley felt its rays beating down on him. But soon more clouds filled the sky, shading Stanley in his hole. He waited until he was certain that the last campers had finished for the day. Then he waited a little longer. As quietly as possible, he and Zero climbed up out of their holes and towards camp. Stanley held the sack in front of him, cradled in his arms. A wave of terror rushed over him when they saw the compound, the tent, the rec room, the warden's cabin, and the 2 oak trees. The fear made him dizzy. He took a breath, summoned his courage, and continued. That's the one, he whispered, pointing out the hole where he had found the gold tube. It was still about 50 yards away, but Stanley was pretty sure it was the right hole. There was no need to risk going any closer. They climbed down into adjacent holes and waited for the camp to fall asleep. See you guys tomorrow.